The most common use of the preterite in Biblical Hebrew by far is the narrative tense. A narrative tense verb indicates sequential action in past time. Given that most of the New Testament's narrative passages are told in that fashion, you will see a large number of narrative verbs as you read the Hebrew Bible text. The form of the Cal narrative appears as if, and it is very important to remember that this is only as if the imperfect form has received the addition of a vav and then doubled its first letter. So for instance, the imperfect yik tol in the narrative has va and the doubling of the yod, va yik tol. The imperfect yishlach, the narrative adds va and then again doubles the first letter of the imperfect, vayishlach. In each of these cases, remember that though this appears as if the vav has changed an imperfect, the narrative is not an imperfect. It is a preterite with the addition of vav and doubling of the first letter. Understanding this will keep you from creating confusion later. The narrative and imperfect, though they look similar, come from different historical origins. In each of these cases, the narrative form would be parsed as a Cal narrative third masculine singular of either katal or shalach, respectively. As you know, aleph, being a guttural, cannot double. When forming the narrative of a first common singular form, then, which already begins in an aleph, the lack of doubling will, as you would expect by now, result in compensatory lengthening of the patak on the vav. So we have an imperfect emod, and we wish to make it a narrative by adding va and then doubling, but the aleph cannot double. Accordingly, the patak lengthens to comets, and we have a narrative of va emod. Now remember again, this relationship between the narrative and the imperfect is only as if. We discussed this way in order to help you understand the formation, but remember that the narrative is an entirely separate tense, a remnant of the preterite, not a usage of the imperfect conjugation. You will also want to carefully note the difference between the narrative and the addition of a simple vav on the imperfect. The narrative forms are always va plus a doubling of the first letter of a form. A simple addition of v with no doubling of the first letter is not a narrative, but is a vav plus imperfect. So the narrative would be vayik tol with va and then a doubling of the yod. Vav plus imperfect would be v yik tol with a schwa and no doubling of the yod. The narrative vayishlach has vav with patak and a doubling of the yod. Vav plus the imperfect would be v yishlach with a schwa and no doubling of the yod. The narrative tense has by far the most restricted use of any of the Hebrew conjugations we have studied or will study. It is used almost exclusively for the sequential telling of a past tense narration. However, given that a large amount of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament is in narrative form, it's no surprise that you will see quite a large number of narrative forms in your study. The habit in this grammar has been to leave exceptions for the second half of the book, to first concentrate on simply understanding the verbal system well. And though we will largely take that methodology, we will note one separate issue here. First, aleph verbs will not be fully covered until chapter 22. But the verb amar, glossed as to say, is so common that we should discuss it now because you will see it regularly. It follows a slightly different vowel pattern because of the aleph in the first syllable, taking in both the imperfect and the narrative a holum for its vowel. So in the imperfect, not yimar, we have instead regularly yomar or yomer. When those forms are put into the narrative, you simply say va plus doubling of the yod. So we have vayomar and vayomer. These two forms are still cal narrative, third masculine singular forms of amar. It is simply that the first root letter being aleph has caused a different voweling for its first root letter.